Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2020 virtual series. My name is Caroline Vagneron, and I'm the Fragility Forum lead. It's my pleasure today to be moderating this panel, which will serve to launch the paper on sexual orientation and gender identity in contexts affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. As you know, in recent years, we have witnessed a sharp increase in violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity around the world. This is also true in countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. The paper today that we will be discussing looks at some of the development and protection challenges that sexual and gender minorities face in this context. So to kickstart this conversation, I will first turn to Maninder Gill and Victor Madrigal-Borloz for some opening remarks. Maninder Gill is Global Director for the World Bank's Environmental and Social Framework, and Victor Madrigal-Borloz is United Nations independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So Maninder, over to you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thanks everyone. Welcome to the launch event of the paper on sexual orientation and gender identity in contexts affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. I'm really delighted to be here today. We have a great lineup of speakers, and special thanks to all of you who made this session possible. As many of you would know, we at the Bank Group are fully committed to the principle of leaving no one behind, and which is the core of Agenda 2030. And we believe that our twin goals of ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity cannot be achieved without a focus on the most excluded groups, including sexual and gender minorities in many contexts or in most contexts. So while we are fully committed, we are also looking for ways to demonstrate and operationalize this commitment, because it's not enough to be only committed in principle. And I believe that that's the reason why today's discussion is so useful, but because it helps move us forward on that desire to operationalize and demonstrate. Again, as many of you would not need to be told this, but although the SOGI specific data, sexual orientation and gender identity specific data remains scarce, all existing evidence suggests that LGBTI people are vastly overrepresented in the economic bottom 40%, and face additional barriers for access to basic services like health and education, social protection, anything where there is interaction and interface with institutions, with government agency, or with other citizens. And it's not only that they are in the bottom 40%, but I think it's the form of exclusion which is sometimes full of social stigma, which is driven by homophobia, regressive norms, and in many contexts, unfortunately, discriminatory laws. And all of these combine to fuel the exclusion and creates huge barriers for development. So if we are serious about Agenda 2030, not leaving anyone behind, achieving the twin goals, we need to confront this agenda boldly and meaningfully. Also, given that we are in 2020, it's hard to imagine this kind of discrimination against any group. And as a principle, it's totally unacceptable. We also know that no country, community, or company can achieve its potential without all of its members achieving theirs. And so there's no way you can deny an important group of their basic rights and access to being able to play the role of of an equal citizen, of realizing their true potential. And it is important that all people are afforded the dignity, which in this case is very important. It's not just about economics and access, but it's full dignity, plus also have the opportunities and ability to participate in markets and have access to services and spaces. And all this is essential in a real development process. Now, although that's the vision, which all of us who work on development fully share, there would be no argument on this. And yet, the world has seen a sharp rise in attacks against sexual and gender minorities, especially in contexts of fragility, conflict, and violence. And we cannot afford to turn a blind eye to this. Even in normal contexts, there is a huge exclusion of sexual and gender minorities. And this gets vastly exacerbated in an FCV context. When institutions are breaking down, often as our family bonds, and there is forced displacement and food insecurity, and you may get this reaction from many otherwise otherwise sensible people. They might say, there is so much going on, hell is breaking loose. Why would you want us to focus on on a special group when everyone is suffering? And in fact, the answer is that that's precisely the reason, because there is a much bigger risk that their rights and their access and their dignity will be disregarded and violated. That's why we who work in such contexts need to be much more vigilant, because the unfortunate reality is that although we are in 2020, which was supposed to be the year of 2020 hindsight vision, where somehow you get it and you have clear focus, but unfortunately, even in 2020, 69 countries still have laws that explicitly criminalize consensual same-sex acts. And many of the same countries are experiencing the most pressing humanitarian crises, and they are hosting large number of refugees and internally displaced people. So it's a very complicated and difficult context. Therefore, it is extremely important that regardless of how challenging it is, we work to ensure and safeguard the safety and rights of LGBTI groups in such environments. And for that, all of us need to work together. Those of us who work on development or peace building or humanitarian work, we need to work together to address SOGI-based violence, discrimination, and exclusion in FCV-affected countries and territories. The bank has been trying to take some well-meaning and initial steps. We have a long way to go, but we are trying to scale up in a big way the resources and effort and the type of financial and other services we offer to address development challenge in FCV countries. In 2020, we launched the World Bank's strategy for fragility, conflict, and violence, which will be for 5 years from 2020 to 25. And protection of all vulnerable groups in FCV settings is a core aspect of this strategy. So we are trying to scale up, we are trying to do better, but in order to do so, it is important to understand how such groups are affected in FCV settings. Because unless we do so, we'll not know where to start, what to do. And that's why the paper we are launching today serves a really important purpose in advancing our knowledge, all the challenge or many of the challenges faced by sexual and gender minorities who live or are required to live in the world's toughest environments. And the paper does so in 3 ways, as we'll soon find out in more detail. It gives special attention to the intersection between SOGI-based exclusion more broadly and access to basic services. It describes the challenges experienced by sexual and gender minorities under conditions of forced displacement, which many of these countries and territories face. And it explains how sexual and gender-based violence is often being used as a weapon against these vulnerable groups in FCV settings, which is the most horrific uh, kind of reality that we see unfolding in many places, unfortunately. The paper also demonstrates and it highlights the importance of generating good data and creating a robust evidence base on all of the challenges faced by gender and sexual minorities living in these contexts. And and what it does is that unless we have this data and we have such evidence, we'll not be able to identify the most critical entry points where we can start to make a difference. For this purpose, on our own side, we have been trying to get our act together, and we have very specifically, we have a really committed and excellent team working on SOGI issues led by our fearless global advisor on SOGI, Cliff Cortez, and his remarkable team who are working with our in-country social scientists. And we have in each and every client country that we work in, including in all FCV countries, we have at least one social scientist. So we have a committed army to work with to address this challenge, and we will continue to work together with our partners to help build the evidence base, which will then help us identify what are the most promising entry points for making transformational difference. Now, this is an area where we are, as I said, we are beginning to take these steps. We are learning in the process. This is an area where civil society and humanitarian and peace actors are in fact playing a much deserved leadership role, and we are more than happy to support them and to learn in the process. This is not an area where we are claiming leadership. This is an area where we are delighted to contribute and learn. This is a shared agenda where all of us need to do everything that we can. And as we all know, we still have a long way to go. So very excited to have this conversation today, and a big thanks to our SOGI team to produce this excellent paper, and to all our external partners and speakers who are helping us brainstorm and think through these issues so that we can craft a collective agenda forward on this extremely important topic. Thank you so much, and back to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Maninder, and very, very good to hear your vision and to see all these elements that you're touching on the importance of connecting on humanitarian development and security sectors, and the different challenges that our panel will shortly touch on. I'd like just now, before turning to our panelists, to ask Victor maybe for some opening remarks. Victor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I'm looking to you to see whether you can hear me well. Perfect. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here today, and I'm thankful to the World Bank and, of course, to the wonderful team that works on SOGI, sexual orientation, and gender identity related issues at the bank. We all know, of course, that this is an issue with which the bank has been working for quite some time, and the issuance of research and tools such as the one that are being unveiled today is an extraordinary contribution to the work of deconstruction, dissection, analysis, and addressing violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I'm delighted to be here. I see this as a learning opportunity. I want to hear very much from the wonderful panel that you have assembled, and from Nico, the presentation of this report. So I will limit myself to making three very brief points in the expectation of their wonderful contribution. The first one is, I think that it's fundamental to underline that this report is capturing the essential need to work within intersectionality. We all embody many identities in one body, and not one single one of them creates particular experiences of privilege or discrimination. It is the intersection of all of them that creates particular lived experiences. But we also know that the acknowledgement of points of entry for analysis is a fundamental part of the work of deconstructing those experiences of violence and discrimination, and of promoting the systemic conditions that actually will change them. This is, of course, what the business of development is the promotion of systemic change. And in that sense, the creation of a tool that allows us to understand violence, discrimination on the key of sexual orientation, gender identity, is a fundamental contribution. And I'm very, very thrilled to see this research coming out. Now, secondly, this is a point that has been forcefully made now by the international community and that is expressed in the creation of my mandate. It is the acknowledgement that sexual orientation and gender identity is one of the necessary points of entry if one is to really dissect, analyze, and deconstruct the phenomenon of social exclusion and discrimination. But of course, there are situations in which discrimination, inequality manifests itself as in on steroids. And I think that this is what happens in situation of conflict violence, and not to be remiss in situations such as the one as we are living right now, the pandemic of COVID-19. As my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Right to Food has said, these are situations of inequality on steroids. And it means that all of the factors that actually create experiences of discrimination and exclusion exacerbate themselves. And I'm therefore particularly thankful that this paper looks carefully about the particular aspects that create experiences of discrimination that we're talking about. On this, the three systemic lines that it actually is addressing of data generation, inclusion in programming and project design, and knowledge generation, training and learning are for me fundamental tools. I'll be very carefully assessing how this report and how these tools that are being provided can be used on this conflict, on this context. And as I said, I'm very, very honored to be here in this discussion. Carolyn, thank you very much for having me, and thrilled for what we're about to hear from Nico, the members of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victor. And I think a number of points you're raising will be coming up through this conversation with our panelists. It's very exciting now for me to turn to this panel that we have with us today for some question and answers. I'll just give you the list of our speakers. We have Nicolas Salazar Godoy, who is a social development consultant at the World Bank and the main author of the report. Sharzad Tajbakhsh, Deputy Director of the International Protection Division of UNHCR. Tamara Adrian, Civil Society Representative from Venezuela. And Callum Watson, Project Coordinator of the Gender and Security Division of DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. As you can tell, I hope you notice, we are really trying to approach around this panel speakers from humanitarian, development, and security fields, because this is one of the elements that comes also through the paper, the importance of the coherence of these interventions brought together to respond to the challenge of SOGI populations in FCV countries. I will start this conversation and Q&A with the first question to the main author of the report, Nico. Nico, would you please walk us through some of the main findings of the report, please?
Yes, of course. Can you please confirm if you can hear me well before I start? Yeah, fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much, Caroline. And thank you very much, everyone, for your time. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to share the main findings of the paper in this forum. Now, I would like to start by asking you a question, a very simple question that you can think about. You may not be able to reply now, but just think about one number. And the question is as follows. Among the 10 countries experiencing the most pressing humanitarian crisis in 2020, how many do you think criminalized consensual same-sex acts? Now, after carefully reviewing the number of persons in need of humanitarian assistance in 2020, we observed with concern that in 6 out of the 10 countries experiencing the most pressing humanitarian crisis in 2020, consensual same-sex acts remain criminalized. So 6 is the number to the question, which is quite a high number. Now, let me share with you some of the main findings relating to this paper. First, on forced displacement. Second, on access to basic services. And third, on sexual and gender-based violence. Now, regarding forced displacement, at a time in history where the number of the forcibly displaced has reached 79.5 million people, and when 80% of the world's displaced are in countries and territories affected by severe food insecurity and malnutrition, we devote special attention to the main development and protection challenges experienced by LGBTI refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs. What is really, really concerning and relevant to the scope of this conversation that we're having is that in 4 out of the 5 countries with the largest number of refugees in 2018, same-sex consensual acts are criminalized. 4 out of 5. The situation is no better in the top 5 countries of origin. In simple words, what we want to say is that LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers face discrimination and violence not only in the countries of origin, but also in the main countries of asylum. We also devote special attention to the rise of SOGI-based asylum claims and to the role that LGBTI grassroots organizations, the UNHCR, the UN independent experts, the governments, and multiple other bilateral and multilateral organizations play in promoting protection for sexual and gender minorities. Relevant to the mutually complementary nature of humanitarian and development interventions, the paper highlights the importance of forging partnerships between humanitarian, development, and private sector actors to find mechanisms that allow the simultaneous economic integration of the forcibly displaced in the host communities and in the local economies. For a very long time, interventions for the forcibly displaced were thought from a humanitarian perspective. Yet today, in 2020, given the protracted nature of most armed conflicts and the long periods that the forcibly displaced are away from home, evidence indicates, and the paper is very clear on that standalone humanitarian responses are insufficient and that rights and development-oriented durable solutions are indispensable. Shahrzad from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for the Refugees will tell us more about this topic shortly. Secondly, by looking at the challenges that sexual and gender minorities face to access basic services such as health and education, we observe with concern that there is a huge lack of data on sexual and gender minorities living in FCV countries. Quality data is absolutely essential for effective development programming, as Maninder said at the beginning. However, FCV countries are among the most data deprived. Social stigma, homophobia, regressive norms, coupled with extremely complex security conditions make data capturing very difficult in these areas. Filling the data gap is therefore key. Challenges to access basic services are even higher when multiple disadvantages overlap, and this is clearly related to some of the opening remarks of the UN independent experts. Issues of race, religion, ethnicity, or disability many times add additional barriers to access basic services for these minority groups. I'll give you an example. The barriers to access higher education for a transgender woman belonging to a religious minority in Khartoum are likely to be higher than those experienced by a gay man from an urban middle-class environment in Sudan's capital. The service delivery capacity in FCV countries is limited even before FCV-associated stresses. However, evidence demonstrates that access to services is even more problematic to persons belonging to minorities. Callum will shortly tell us more about DCAP's work on gender equality and basic services providers in the FCV countries where he works. Finally, very finally, the paper devotes a chapter to sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV. As Victor pointed at the very beginning, sexual and gender minorities are exposed to disproportionate levels of violence and discrimination in peace times. Yet, in conditions of armed conflict and other forms of violence, the collapse of institutions, safe spaces, and of the already weak family and community bonds contributes to exacerbate their vulnerabilities. In most FCV countries, the fragility associated stresses are coupled with discriminatory laws and judiciary systems with very limited justice delivery capacities. Rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, for example, have carefully documented cases of SGBV against its minority groups. Similarly, the report highlights that LGBTI organizations working in conflict-affected environments have raised awareness on the effects of the failure to address both the physical and psychological effects of sexual torture, sexualized violence, and other forms of SGBV. Evidence suggests that SGBV survivors who do not receive adequate and timely assistance carry deep psychological wounds, which left unattended can manifest themselves in multiple negative forms. To date, and I will close with this remark, there is no global protection framework to safeguard the rights of sexual and gender minorities in armed conflicts. Various legal experts have persuasively defined this issue as a blind spot in international humanitarian law, and many have urged the international community to advance towards developing protection mechanisms that are fit for the 21st century's challenges in conflict zones. I will leave it here for now, and over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Nico. Great to get an overview before we dig deeper in all these areas of the report and key findings of the report. Shahrzad, maybe starting with you, may I turn to you now? What we would like to look at is what are some of the particular challenges that are experienced by LGBTI refugees or asylum seekers or by the organizations supporting them? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you very much to colleagues in the World Bank and also to the Special Rapporteur for the welcoming comments to this important discussion we're having today. I really would like to start, if I may, Caroline, before responding to your question, by echoing what we heard from the Special Rapporteur and really thanking Nico and the World Bank in putting together what I also believe, and I take his words from him, the extraordinary contribution that this paper is really giving to this area of work. You know, we read right at the outset of the non-paper how there has been broad consensus that basically development and humanitarian interventions that are deployed in fragile conflict and violence affected contexts, that they must be gender sensitive. But as the paper really highlighted, I think it is true to say that the gender dialogue remains overwhelmingly focused on the impacts of fragility on girls and women. Even that, I have to say, we haven't gone as far as we need to. But certainly what the paper rightly highlights, and this is why I'm incredibly grateful for this discussion, is that there is undoubtedly insufficient attention given to the multiple ways in which fragility, conflict, violence impacts on sexual and gender minorities and to the various issues that inform violence, discrimination, and exclusion against minorities, and in particular those with sexual orientation and gender identity considerations in that context. So I did want, if I could, put in a plug, in fact, obviously for everyone to read the paper, which I do think is excellent. And I can say that because we didn't write it, but also just really this first figure on page 2 of the paper really, I think, is an image that really is very telling. it has basically an iceberg, and it has under the water all of the various different elements and issues that actually impact on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex individuals, and how that impacts on the violence, discrimination, exclusion as the actual response coming out from that. And it's a telling figure that I wanted to just flag your attention to, if I may, because it goes also to what the special rapporteur said right at the outset, which really our work is aimed at promoting and engaging to enable systemic changes, and also systematic changes in this context, but certainly systemic changes. And unless we come to terms with all of the different multiple ways in which these various angles actually impact on sexual and gender minorities, and how they're exacerbated, as we also heard from the special rapporteur, we're not going to be able to have that impact that we're looking to impact in the context of violence, discrimination, and exclusion in that context. So really just broadly touching on what are the particular challenges that are experienced in the context of sexual orientation and gender identity considerations. Now, I actually wanted to take a few minutes to walk us through the displacement cycle, to really show that the challenges start from the country of origin to flight, to the country of asylum, and back to the solutions if it exists in this context. So already during flight, from the countries of origin. So of course, I have to say the concerns arise already in the countries of origin, and we heard from Nico why. When you look at the numbers of laws, discriminatory laws, and so forth. But it really is also the basis on which people are fleeing. It fulfills the refugee definition in that context, in that people face persecution on account of their membership in a particular social group. And so these are critical elements for recognition of the fact that we're talking about refugees, which in of itself is not so easily and quickly understood. Then during the flight, we have to also recognize that lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex, if I may go on by referring to LGBTI, individuals and refugees, they actually often during flight face the same abuses that they faced back in their own countries of origin. So they are unable, and here I have to stress, to actually access the type of support and protection from other displaced people who might have also led their countries of origin, but under different circumstances. Or that the circumstances of the LGBTI refugees are actually exacerbated in those particular contexts. So unlike others who come and during flight, they share maybe common national, ethnic, political, or religious backgrounds, and there's a level of common support amongst each other, that often doesn't exist with LGBTI refugees who are fleeing persecution. And that already creates a challenge for them beyond the challenge of a refugee flight that others might be experiencing. Now, upon arrival in the countries of asylum, again, there are a group that, if they're not invisible, often they might wish to make themselves invisible because of the concerns and the protection challenges and frankly, continued violence that they do face in countries of asylum. So, that has an impact on the fact that they're not able to access adequate or timely, accurate information on ways in which they can access services as newly arriving refugees in the countries of asylum. So again, their circumstances are exacerbated, and as we heard, it really is inequality on steroids. Already refugees face challenges. You add to that their particular circumstances of this minority. Now, their fact that they might wish to remain invisible for their own protection exacerbates the problems in that there is an under-identification of LGBTI persons who could actually be able to get services to them if they were identified on time, and that you would be able to refer to them to humanitarian agencies, for example, for the type of support. That doesn't really happen. They inevitably face more challenges than others when it comes to arbitrary detention by security forces. And I have to say, unfortunately, transgender and visibly gender non-conforming persons, they face even a more acute risk of being arbitrarily detained simply because of maybe the way they speak or dress, or whether or not and how they might comport themselves that might be different from the other refugees or from the hosting communities. Especially, and this is particularly problematic, and we heard from Nico, when 6 out of the 10 countries hosting the largest number of refugees, that's the case, in countries where, the countries of asylum, who have criminalized consensual same-sex relations. This obviously makes it even more challenging for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex refugees to get the type of protection that they need. Now, during the asylum procedures, again, I'm just walking us through the displacement cycle. So during the actual asylum procedures, LGBTI persons experience bias, invasive questioning by interviewers who have zero sensitivities or knowledge on these issues, including on the way in which the refugee definition should be interpreted to enable recognition for the individuals. And certainly, unfortunately, also a lack of confidentiality and privacy, and prejudices also at the hands of interpreters who are engaging. So it really, many challenges in the asylum procedures going forward. Now, they equally have problems in obtaining accurate legal identity documents, whether it's because of discrimination or especially for transgender and gender non-conforming persons, the accurate legal identity is problematic in terms of documentation for them. And that in turn creates challenges for them to access safe and dignified housing, healthcare, education, various opportunities for economic self-sufficiency in the asylum countries where they're living. And then, unfortunately, it has to be said, heartbreakingly, there are particularly high risks of experiencing discrimination, sexual assault, and other forms of gender-based violence, which I have to say, unfortunately, remains rampant in.
Shahrazad, you've muted yourself, I believe.
I feel very emotional on these aspects, sorry. And then there's the final point around whether it's their experiences in their countries of origin or their experiences in the country of asylum. We have seen high rates of depression, of anxiety, of post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal considerations, and other mental health challenges, deep psychological trauma, as Nico also flagged. And again, a sense of shaming and rejection in the countries of asylum where they're locating, and an inability to access the needed mental health services that would be needed. And as their stay in countries of asylum gets prolonged, because solutions are so limited, and even when others and conflict might be subsiding and others might be repatriating to their countries of origin, other refugees, LGBTI persons, because they have faced extra concerns beyond the simple conflict in their countries of asylum, their solution often doesn't lie for them to return to their countries of origin. So they have prolonged stay in uncertain situations, with severe economic pressures on them, inability to access labor markets and circumstances to enable them to live and have an adequate standard of living. And so often we have to turn to resettlement opportunities for them to third countries, and that is incredibly limited in numbers of spaces that are available. So really, I try to not go on too long, but really to show how throughout the whole cycle of displacement, the challenges are enormous for this group of minorities. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Shahrazad. And I want to turn shortly to Tamara to talk about the challenge of accessing basic health services, for example, or the particular situation of trans persons. But before that, briefly, and I know it won't do justice to the work that is done by UNHCR, can you walk us through very briefly the efforts that are made by UNHCR to protect LGBTI persons during displacement, but also to find durable solutions for them? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you very much to World Bank. I can't just accept that 10 years have elapsed, and the first time I went to the World Bank trying to talk about SOGI issues directly, and you were one of the very first persons I talked to about these issues and how to promote, how to engage World Bank into this fight against poverty caused by homophobia and transphobia. And we have done a long way since then, in a way that now we have a special rapporteur, we have so many declarations, but we still need for more acceptance and more willingness from the countries. Perhaps, Nicolas, you should add another country to your list. Venezuela, it's the only country in the Latin American region that actually criminalizes same-sex relations, but only in one field, in the military. It is punished by 1 to 3 years in jail for having what in the law is called contra natura, against nature relations. So you have another demonstration of what you actually said before about the relation between refugee crisis, humanitarian crisis, and criminalization of, in this case, of gay people. Addressing your questions, one, it has been quite frustrating for me being in the Congress of Venezuela, in the National Assembly of Venezuela, in this very moment, because the regime led by Maduro has practically suppress all the powers of the National Assembly to legislate, to make impeachments, all the normal powers that the National Assembly could have, including the funds. So we are not paid,
Sorry, just want to make sure, in the interest of time, do you want to really focus on the question of the challenges, the health challenges of LGBTI people who are HIV positive in Venezuela today?
Yes.
I'm just concerned that we have very few minutes to have the other speakers come in. Thank you so much.
I know, but I just wanted to say that in this context, what we can do as MP is very little. As we are prevented by the Supreme Tribunal of Justice to do anything, and our funds are cut. And in this context, we have a very difficult situation. We have a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, as many of you know. This has been proved by another analysis made by the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, and disclosed just 3 days ago, where it is shown that 96% of all Venezuelans live under poverty. 96%. That means there is only around 4% of people that are not poor in this moment in Venezuela. In this context, there is no antiretrovirals. And those who get antiretrovirals are because on the personal basis programs such as A2A's or other programs that help some individuals on getting these antiretrovirals. But the Pan American Organization of Health also try to get some loans to the government of Maduro in order to get some antiretrovirals, but this loan was not paid, and the Inter-American and the American Pan American Association of Health did not get access to other antiretrovirals. With regard to trans people, in this moment, the situation in Latin America has been from the legal point of view, improving. In this moment, you have the right to be legally recognized as a man or a woman on individual basis on your request and with no pathologizing requirements in Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, and somehow Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, and Bolivia. Venezuela used to recognize the identity of trans people until 1998 by jurisprudence, but it stopped in 1998 when Chavez arrived to the power and replaced all the judges that were in place up to that moment and appointed new judges that were not duly trained. And since then, no single person has been awarded with the recognition of legal identity. And as Sherzad just said, it is a burden that is very difficult to overcome for trans people to get to have access to an on equal basis to the most basic rights, so the right to be educated. They are mostly excluded from or self-excluded from education very early, work decent jobs from a decent lodgement, and in general, of very simple rights. And this causes a very important burden to internal product of the countries, as it has been shown in other papers produced also by the World Bank. Therefore, we have a lot of work to do. I thank Maninder for his words in this sense. I also thank the UN special advisor for his work in these years, and please count on Victor on our support to you and to your work, and to the World Bank for its work. It works in this field that is not an easy field, because you confront all kind of prejudices and bias, as it happens also with race, with religion, with xenophobia, and with misogynia, and other kind of bias and prejudices that prevent people to get equal rights and to fully develop their personality. Then, as the World Bank always say, the goal is to have equal rights and that no one left behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Thank you. So we've touched on a number of issues of accessing basic services, education, health. I would like to turn now to our fourth speaker, Callum. You work with security and justice institutions. So can you please tell us how DCAF, your organization, engages with sexual and gender minorities in fragile and conflict-affected countries? Over to you, Callum.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and it's a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel. So I think, as you mentioned before, DCAF is the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. By and large, we are working with state security and justice actors. However, we do also work on security and justice sector oversight, which means that we do engage with non-governmental organizations and parliamentarians as well. It's very rare as DCAF that we get an explicit mandate to work on sexual and gender minorities or on LGBTI people in name. But by and large, we found that we've been able to engage security and justice actors on this topic by two principal windows of opportunity. The first is to do it within the context of gender equality, and the second one is to do it within the perspective of human rights. So I'll just go through that a little bit, because I think it actually provides some perhaps positive hope to ways that we can actually engage on this topic, even in contexts where perhaps there hasn't been a historical engagement on LGBTI people, or we don't have an explicit mandate. So when we do work on doing training, for example, that relates to gender equality. We're having highly interactive training sessions. We're really encouraging everybody to feel like they're in a safe space. So there's no stupid questions. They can ask whatever they like. And obviously, me as a white person coming in from a former colonial power, I'm not there to tell them what gender equality is. I'm there to give them tools that will maybe get them to explore how they engage with their own particular genders. Once you begin to detach sex and gender, once you begin to talk about how gender is a social construction, how women can display masculinity, how men can display femininity, what tends to happen is that people will themselves bring up the topic of sexual and gender minorities. So what that means is, even if we didn't have an explicit mandate to talk about it, it might not necessarily appear on the slide. I have to be ready for that question. What that often means is I've done my homework, so I've read up on what the legal situation is in that country. I've perhaps read up on NGO reports, what the Human Rights Council has said. I've looked at organizations such as ILGA, so that's an international network of different LGBTI associations around the world. Sometimes, if I'm very lucky, I've even been able to meet with them beforehand, because they may not have a very good relationship or direct contact with the security sector. And it means that when that teachable moment appears, which it almost certainly does, I'm ready to engage people on it. And it might be sometimes a quip, you know, people will laugh about a gay person or someone who's from a gender minority, and I'm ready for that question. And I'll go, okay, let's stop for a second. We've talked about sex, we've talked about gender. Okay, well, what is sexual orientation? Is a trans identity, is that a form of sexual orientation? No, that's about gender, so that fits in there. So what you can do is you can really engage people in a discussion. And sometimes I think I've gone into situations, perhaps with my own stereotypes, thinking, oh, well, I'm not going to be able to talk about sexual and gender minorities with a group of peacekeepers from 11 different nations in Kenya. But at the end of the session, I was interrupted by a Kenyan peacekeeper, and she said, we haven't talked about LGBTI people. A Senegalese peacekeeper quipped, yeah, what about gay people? And then a Sierra Leonean said, yeah, in Sierra Leone, we actually have a third gender. So I think once you begin to kind of put a bit of curiosity into these training sessions, actually you can get security and justice providers to talk about this topic themselves. And I think it's worth highlighting two things. The first is that just because a topic might be taboo doesn't actually mean it's not spoken about. Where sexual and gender minorities are seen as a kind of controversial issue, it actually means that newspapers, the media is talking about this topic all the time. So in fact, you find people have been waiting for this topic for ages, and you can provide a safe and respectful, informative space where they can share their different ideas. Often I ask them about the different sexual and gender minorities in the countries and the kinds of challenges they might face. And the second point I want to make is that members of the security and justice sector actually engage with all different parts of society. So we've actually found that they're often quite frustrated not to have been able to talk about this topic before, because it's actually part of their job to engage with sexual and gender minorities. And also when we look at migration, if you're working in border guards, you need to know what to do. And security and justice actors are very irritated when they don't have a mandate, because if they have to make subjective decisions themselves, they might face consequences later on with the higher ups. The other way we can look at it is from the perspective of human rights. And we've talked a lot about the fact that same-sex consensual relations are criminalized in a lot of countries. But what I think is important to highlight from the work of the Human Rights Council is that there's no country in which it's legal to subject sexual and gender minorities to violence if you're not one of the state actors, right? So we're looking at rule of law. If you've got a situation where security and justice actors do not have a monopoly of force, where it's acceptable that mobs of people attack sexual and gender minorities, then you're failing as a security sector. So we often highlight then that there are human rights safeguards that do exist in those countries. They can belong to international conventions. Sometimes we even put it to local consultants in the area, actually, what are the protections that currently exist? And we also pose this to states. And I think this is interesting because it comes back to Nico's point about the lack of data. We're in a position to demand that data. What is the data? Do we know how bad the situation is? Who is particularly targeted? So once we look at it from this framework, and I think also you can look at it from regional frameworks, be that the Council of Europe, if you're working with a country like Ukraine, you can kind of create competition between the different countries who want to demonstrate that actually they're very good at safeguarding human human rights. So rather than focusing just on what is criminalized, we can also focus on what isn't criminalized. And I think there's also opportunities, again, when you're working with justice actors. For example, we did this in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's often the case that people who are exposed to homophobia or transphobia are not actually homosexual and not actually trans, right? They're people who are perceived in this way. So we give scenarios where we say, okay, what would you do in this case in your courtroom? And actually, it's a very interesting situation because I can sit back and I can watch these people debate different areas of law, and actually they're creating knowledge and they're thinking, wait a minute, I as a judge, I'm the only person who can solve this situation. So you're really trying to instill a sense of leadership and also to try and make this into more of a technical rather than a political situation. I'm not going to deny that we do encounter challenges sometimes. So often terminology is a big challenge that we face. In some contexts, we can call things LGBTI. In other contexts, we have to talk about sexual and gender minorities. I think it's always important to navigate that a little bit. I will say that it's interesting in particularly Islamic countries that they might be much more open-minded to talk about trans people first or third gender people first before sexual people from different sexual orientations. So it's important to know your entry point. But honestly, from all of the work that I've done, simply one of the biggest challenges I've faced is that people in headquarters don't have the courage to bring up this question. Often they think that they're going to lose influence, for example, when we're talking on gender equality, because we haven't fully achieved gender equality yet. And sometimes I think we need to consider the fact that just as when we talk about gender neutral interventions or gender blindness as actually being not a form of neutrality, but a way to reinforce existing hierarchies, if we're not talking about sexual and gender minorities, that's not a form of us respecting the local or national cultures that we're working with. Actually, what's happening is we're reinforcing those power hierarchies that already exist. And sometimes we need to recognize that as the international actors, as the people who hold the purse strings, we are able to engage on this topic, and we're sometimes able to bring the voice of sexual and gender minorities in the countries that we're working in to the attention of the government. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's the point you're making on sharing knowledge, raising awareness that was resonating with Shahrzad earlier. I think it also resonates a lot with Nicola and the team that has been working on this report within the World Bank, the effort that is required to bring everybody up to speed on this agenda to be able to all work together on this. Thank you so much. Maybe we have a few minutes left. Can I go back to Shahrzad and ask Shahrzad very briefly to come back to the role of UNHCR in support of LGBTI, refugee and asylum seekers? Very briefly, Shahrzad, and then we'll turn to Victor and Maninder for closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, Caroline, thank you very much. Maybe just really quickly to say that for us, the critical important in engaging and doing our protection work is to do it in a manner that it takes on to account the age, gender, and diversity situation. And it really implies, or actually concretely requires us to engage with the concerned communities directly, both to hear about what their protection circumstances are, but also to include them in the solutions that are being proposed. So in that context, UNHCR globally is increasingly, and I have to say, it is also a process. We are not, by far, I have to admit, there yet in terms of me being able to confidently say that absolutely in all of our operations we do this. But I do and can, happily and confidently say that increasingly in our operations, we are identifying LGBTI-led organizations or other organizations with whom we're collaborating in order to do a reach out to LGBTI persons for us to be able to identify what their protection concerns and what their own perceptions or perspectives on the solutions might be. In Bangladesh, for example, we work with organizations that are trusted by the LGBTI community in order to do the reach out to ensure and see how they might be or might not be accessing different protection or services that might be available. In Turkey, we're also acting out actively with regular visits, again, through trusted community leaders to LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers who are living outside of the centers to identify and make links, for example, to vetted landlords who could provide them effective housing opportunities in a non-discriminatory way. This requires a lot of capacity building, as we also heard as well. So we engage a lot with different partners so that we can enable equitable access to services to LGBTI displaced persons. For example, in Kenya, we work with national LGBTI organizations to strengthen their capacities to engage and to train in turn government officials. Côte d'Ivoire, we're training them on national asylum procedures so they can take effective decisions. In Europe, we're working with the European Asylum Support Office to get feedback on what some of the key challenges are that people are facing. In Morocco, we're engaging with implementing partners to organize regular focus groups, discussions with LGBTI individuals to enhance their awareness on their rights. So it's a lot of engagement with the vision of an age, gender, and diversity approach to work with the communities themselves. And I can't stress that enough. But I do want to say, and I hate to end on a bit of a negative note, but I will say that I think we have to be humble enough, including us as UNHCR, to say we're not there yet to say that, you know, we have it well covered. But we are also recognize that there's a lot more to do, and we're committed to doing that. And so we have a global roundtable that they're organizing in 2021 that I hope to see many of you engage in its preparations and there, where we will actually be able to have a discussion around what are the current challenges, what are some good practices, what are some good networkings that could be done, and then identify priority areas to go forward on this. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ada. Thanks a lot for this. We're going to be coming to the hour, so I would like to invite Victor maybe to provide some closing remarks before we say goodbye. Victor?
Thank you very much, Caroline. I'm very thankful to Nico, to Scheherazade, to Tamara, and to Callum for what they've shared with us. As I said at the beginning, when I read this tool, this research and this guide, it struck me that it is a very valuable building block in the work that we are all carrying out in providing elements that allow government, state, and non-state actors with tools to analyze and address violence and discrimination. But of course, what all of us have witnessed over the last hour, and it has felt like a very quick hour for me, like it's a very short hour. You know how sometimes you have long hours and sometimes you have short hours. Well, this was a very short hour. I really wish that it could be 3 times as long. And the reason is because what you have is a collection of experiences. Scheherazade, whose generous words I thank, provides us with the standpoint of an organization that has already many years and that to me provides good practice and in some cases best practice of how to mainstream that prism, that point of entry into understanding how sexual orientation and gender identity becomes a factor in all of this cycle of exclusion, again, exacerbated in extreme situations such as conflict, violence, and frailty. Tamara Adrian, whose work we all know and have admired for so long, provides us the standpoint of somebody who works from parliamentary institutions and who has been working hard at understanding how law and parliamentary initiatives can actually be married in situations of crisis with political will and measures to remedy. And of course, the experience that Callum was presenting to us is really enormous, but also extremely useful as it is informed from very practical perspectives. And so all of that under the I would say, frame of this research that Nico and the team at World Bank have carried out. I go back to something that Scheherazade said. The the iceberg portrayed in this report. My mandate is tasked with exploring root causes. And of course, there is something about understanding how gender nonconformity or nonconformity in relation to what is considered to be a desirable norm on sexual orientation is the determinant for violence and discrimination, enabled by very many means, some of which may be criminalization, pathologization, or what I call demonization. And I call those the unholy trinity, if you will allow me the literary reference, is crime, sin, and illness. And it's this idea that LGBTI or otherwise diverse existences are somehow detrimental or disordered. And this is what we're fighting against and what gets us exacerbated in situations of extreme need or crisis. What we've witnessed here today is a collection of good practice and significant knowledge on what are keys and tools to provide for that. I am immensely grateful. And as you know, not only the people on this call, but also all of our esteemed audience, the mandate of the independent expert is fully dedicated to this endeavor. And I am delighted, very honored to have been invited to this discussion and wholly committed to working with all of you to take forward this agenda. Thank you very much, Maninder. Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, Nico, for this invitation.
Thank you so much, Victor. Maninder, you have the last word.
Thanks, Caroline. I think last word only literally, not figuratively and not intellectually. I think the objective was to learn, and I learned a lot. And I realized listening to all of you that, clearly I am the one who needs to learn the most. The presentations were, as Victor said, it was a really short hour. The presentations were excellent. And I think Victor's summary was so powerful and outstanding that I would not want to add anything to that. All I would want to say is that something happened in this 1 hour, which I wasn't expecting. I thought we will be affirming all important things and making further strengthening our resolve to do more and to have more evidence and data so that we can inform action going forward. In fact, I heard a lot of very practical and operational entry points, which we can take on board today and start working on right away. And I wasn't expecting that, So I'm really delighted, and I would urge, and in fact, up to a point I was making notes, and then I realized now that the time is very short, and Victor did such an outstanding summary that I don't want to even venture to try to list them. But all I would say is that I hope we are taking good notes, and I think as we have dozens of refugee operations, many of them are under preparation, and operations involving IDPs and refugees and other work in FCV context. Let's make sure what we heard today, we can start translating into action from tomorrow. I don't think we have any excuse to let this, marinate and mature, because it's ready. And these were such operational practical tips that we can start working on them right away. So big thanks to everyone. Huge thanks to you, Caroline, for moderating and organizing, and to Nico and team for the paper, for the excellent presentations, and for a wonderful summary by Victor. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. With this, we're going to be closing this fascinating panel. Thank you so much to all our speakers and to our audience. Please keep on checking the calendar for the Fragility Forum. A lot of interesting sessions coming up in the coming weeks, including a session specifically focused on an operational workshop working on supporting sexual orientation and gender identity challenges coming in a couple of weeks at the end of August in the forum. Thank you all, and see you soon. Bye-bye.